The wrench slips in my hand for the third time because my fingers are shaking, and I set it down on the tailgate of the truck before I drop it on my foot. It's 31 degrees in that gravel lot behind the Kilbride place, and I can see my breath, and I can see the shape of the man on the ground 12 feet away. His hip bent wrong, his church shoes pointed at 2 different directions, snow starting to catch in his eyebrows. Nobody's called an ambulance yet. Genevieve Kilbride is standing on the porch with her arms crossed, saying something about how he shouldn't have been carrying the turkey fryer in the first place, like the falling was his fault and not the ice she told him to walk on. I'm already moving. I don't remember deciding to move. My knees hit the gravel next to him and he looks up at me, and the first thing he says before anything else, before pain, before an ambulance is, "Don't let them move the truck." That's Otis Kilbride for you. 81 years old, hip probably broken, and worried about a Ford Ranger. If you're new here, welcome to Calm Revenge Tales, the channel where we tell true stories about the people who get overlooked, underestimated, and pushed to the edge of their own families, and what happens when the bill finally comes due. I promise you this. By the end of this story, everyone gets exactly what they earned. Nothing more. Nothing less. If that sounds like justice to you, subscribe because it's coming. I'm a diesel mechanic. 12 years now, ASE certified in 4 categories, and I run my own 2-bay shop outside Zanesville, Ohio, called Ferrera Diesel and Fleet. I built that shop from a $15,000 loan and 4 years of 60-hour weeks, and I paid it off 18 months early. Nobody handed me anything. My father laid pipe for 30 years and my mother cleaned offices at night, and the one thing they taught me without ever saying it out loud was that you don't wait for people to give you what's yours. You go get it and you keep the receipt. I married into the Kilbride family 9 years ago. Desmond Kilbride is a good man, quieter than his mother would like, and about as capable of standing up to Genevieve as a screen door is of stopping a hurricane. The Kilbrides ran a salvage yard for 3 generations, Kilbride and Sons, out on Route 40, and by the time I came along, Sons meant Desmond's older brother Marcus, who managed the books and nobody else. Otis Kilbride, Desmond's great-uncle, had been pushed out of that business so long ago that most of the family talked about him like a fixture instead of a person. He lived in the converted garage behind the main house, no rent, no lease, fixing small engines for cash and eating whatever Genevieve decided to send out to him, which some weeks was generous. I was the only one who drove out there just to sit with him. He taught me how to set valve lash on a flathead 6 the year Desmond and I got married, sitting on 2 overturned buckets, and he called me the only Kilbride who ever asked him a question he wanted to answer. The rest of the family called him Uncle Otis when they needed something fixed for free, and called him that old man every other day of the year. The Thanksgiving invitation came with conditions which should have told me everything. Genevieve called in early November, and her exact words were, "We'd love to have you and Desmond, obviously, but I don't think it's necessary to bring the truck this year. Priscilla's been having such a hard time with her car situation, and it just looks better if we're not flaunting things." I asked her what the truck situation had to do with Thanksgiving dinner. She laughed the laugh she uses when she wants you to think you're being paranoid and said, "It's nothing, it's just optics, Odalise." I should have hung up the phone right there. Instead I said we'd come because Otis had told me 3 weeks earlier on the phone, in a voice thinner than I'd heard from him before, that his hip had been bothering him and he wasn't sure he'd make it through a whole dinner sitting up, and I wanted to see him. The truck in question was a 2019 Ford Ranger, $8,140, purchased in cash from a fleet auction in Columbus, titled in my name only, insured under my policy, paid for out of the account that has my name on it and nobody else's. I mention the exact number because numbers don't lie the way people do. My sister-in-law Priscilla Kilbride Vance had wrecked her 3rd car in 4 years 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, and instead of anyone suggesting Priscilla learn to drive more carefully, or budget better, or take the bus, the family's collective imagination landed on my truck like a fly landing on the one plate of food left uncovered. I noticed the irony even then, sitting in my kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand. Genevieve kept saying the family agreed, the family decided. Like the family was a jury that had convened and deliberated and reached a unanimous verdict, when the family, as far as I could tell, was just her, talking to herself in a mirror and calling it consensus. I filed that thought away without knowing yet how much it would matter. We drove out on the Wednesday before, 20 minutes early, so I could see Otis before the house filled up. He was sitting in his one chair by the space heater, a coffee can of assorted hardware balanced on his knee, sorting bolts by thread pitch the way he always did when his hands needed something to hold on to. "You didn't bring the truck," he said, not a question. I told him what Genevieve had said. He didn't say anything for a while, just kept sorting bolts, and then he said, "That's not a family vote. That's a woman deciding what she wants and dressing it up as everybody." I laughed because it was funny, and because I didn't yet know how much weight that sentence would end up carrying. Outside, through the one window in that garage, I could see the main house lit up gold, and I remember thinking it looked warmer than it was going to be. Thanksgiving dinner was at the big table Otis himself had built 40 years earlier out of a single slab of red oak, the same table that had been the centerpiece of every Kilbride holiday since before I existed. 12 people. Marcus at one end, Genevieve at the other. Otis was seated at the far corner, past the good silverware, next to where the extra folding chairs get pulled out for the grandkids. Nobody had asked him if his hip could handle sitting that low. Dinner went fine for exactly 40 minutes. Then Priscilla, 3 glasses of wine into the afternoon, said, loud enough for the whole table, "So when am I actually getting the truck?" Mom said it was basically decided. I said calmly that it wasn't decided because it was my truck, bought with my money, titled in my name, and it wasn't going anywhere. Genevieve set her fork down with a sound like a small gavel and said, "The family voted on this, Odalise. It's not personal. We just think Priscilla needs it more than you do, given everything." I asked her, still calm, to name one other person in the family besides herself who had voted. The table went quiet. Marcus looked at his plate. Desmond looked at his plate. Nobody answered. That's when Otis, 81 years old, folding chair, corner seat, said the thing that got him thrown out of his own family's house. He said, "There wasn't a vote, Genevieve. I've lived on this property 51 years, and I've never once seen you ask anybody anything you didn't already have the answer to." The room went still the way a shop goes still right before a belt snaps. Genevieve's face didn't move for a second, and in that second I saw something under the anger, a flicker gone fast, that looked almost like fear, like a woman who'd built her whole authority on nobody ever saying that sentence out loud, and now somebody had. Then she stood up and told him he wasn't welcome at her table if he was going to talk to her like that in front of her grandchildren. She said it in the voice you'd use on a dog that had gotten up on the furniture. Otis didn't argue. He stood up slow, one hand on the table, the same table he'd built, and he said, "All right. One word." He started toward the door on his own, and his hip caught, and he had to grab the door frame, and nobody moved to help him. 12 people at a table full of food, and nobody moved. I stood up. I didn't say anything to Genevieve. I got Otis's coat off the hook by the door, and I got his arm over my shoulder, and I walked him out into that same gravel lot. Colder now, dark now, and I said loud enough for the house to hear through the screen door, "We're leaving because I want to, not because anybody made me." Marcus's youngest, 13 years old, started to say something from the doorway. "Wait, is Uncle Otis?" And Genevieve cut her off before she finished the sentence. I didn't look back to see the girl's face. I've thought about that unfinished sentence more times than I can count since. Otis moved into my house that night, into the spare room I'd been using for a workbench of my own. I gave up the room without discussing it with Desmond first, because there wasn't anything to discuss. What that decision cost in plain numbers looked like this: $210 a month for the visiting home health aide who came 3 mornings a week to help him bathe, because his hip made the shower stall a hazard. $45 every 10 days for the blood pressure medication his old insurance barely covered. A $90 grab bar and non-slip mat installed in my one bathroom, put in myself on a Sunday with a masonry bit and a level. I picked up 2 extra fleet accounts at the shop, night crews for a regional trucking company, oil changes and brake jobs starting at 11 p.m., to cover it, and I never once told anyone at that house what any of it cost, because Otis would have tried to leave if he'd known, and Genevieve would have used it as proof that I'd made my bed and could lie in it. He came with almost nothing. A duffel bag of clothes, a shaving kit, And one object he wouldn't let me carry for him even with his hip the way it was. A rusted red metal toolbox, Craftsman brand, corners worn down to bare metal, a padlock through the latch that he kept the key to on a shoelace around his neck, day and night, even sleeping. I asked him once what was in it. He said, "Nothing that matters yet," and went back to sorting bolts. I let it go. I've learned that some men keep locked boxes the way some women keep old letters, not because the contents are valuable, but because the box is the last room they get to close the door on. Genevieve called 11 days after Thanksgiving. Her voice had the particular warmth people use right before they ask you for something. She said the holidays wouldn't feel right without all of us, and maybe Otis could come stay at his place, the garage, for Christmas week, just to keep things simple, and I could come too, of course, if I wanted. I told her Otis wasn't a piece of furniture to be moved back and forth depending on the season, and that if she wanted to see him, she knew where I lived. She didn't call again until spring. There was a night in February I still think about more than almost any other night that year. I came home past 10 from a fleet job, hands still smelling of diesel and brake cleaner, and Otis was up, hip propped on a pillow, cooking. He'd made smothered pork chops the way his own mother had taught him 70 years earlier, dredged in flour and black pepper, seared in bacon fat, braised low in a skillet gravy with onions gone translucent and sweet. He'd used my kitchen like it was a shop he was finally allowed to run his own way. We ate at 11 o'clock at night at my kitchen table, and he told me between bites about the first engine he ever rebuilt at 19 years old, a flathead Ford in his own father's barn, and how his father had never once thanked him for it, and how he'd decided that night, 19 years old, that being thanked and being right were two different things, and a man could survive a long time on the second one alone. I didn't know yet how much that sentence would matter either. The toolbox sat under his bed the whole time he lived with me. I'd catch him some nights running his thumb along the padlock, not opening it, just checking it was still locked, the way you check a stove was off. If you've ever solved someone else's crisis quietly, at your own expense, while the people who caused it went on with their holidays like nothing happened, you already know exactly the kind of tired I'm talking about. That's the tired that doesn't show up on your face. It shows up in your bank statement, in your sleep schedule, and nowhere else. If this story is already sitting with you the way it sat with me, subscribe now, because the rest of it, the part where the bill actually gets paid, is coming, and you don't want to miss the moment this turns. Otis Kilbride died on the 8th of April, a Tuesday, in the emergency room at Genesis Hospital in Zanesville, of a stroke that the doctor said had likely been building for weeks. I was the one who found him that morning, in the chair by the space heater I'd moved into my sunroom for him, the coffee can of bolts still balanced on his knee, sorted, every last one by thread pitch, like he'd finished a job before he clocked out. I called Desmond. Desmond called his mother. Genevieve's first words, according to Desmond, were, "Well, where's he going to be buried?" Not the family plot, surely, after everything. I didn't hear her say it. I didn't need to. It matched everything else. I paid for the funeral. $2,200 cremation, a simple oak box, because I knew from 9 years of listening to him that Otis thought caskets were money spent on a man who can't spend it back. His words exactly. Genevieve showed up to the small service I held at my own house, 12 chairs in my living room, and she cried, real tears. I want to be fair about that, real tears, and she said, "He was like a father to me," in a voice pitched for the room for witnesses, and I watched Marcus's face when she said it, and I saw his jaw tighten the way a man's jaw tightens when he's heard a version of history he knows isn't true and has decided, once again, not to correct it. The toolbox came to the funeral with him in a sense. I'd found it under the bed that morning, still locked, and I'd set it on the mantel without opening it, because it felt like something that shouldn't be opened alone in a quiet house by a woman still in yesterday's clothes. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived from a law office in Newark, Ohio, addressed to me, Odalise Ferreira, requesting my presence at a reading of the last will and testament of Otis Raymond Kilbride, along with a formal notice, copied to Genevieve Kilbride, Marcus Kilbride, and Priscilla Kilbride Vance, regarding matters of unresolved corporate interest in Kilbride and Sons Salvage Incorporated. We sat in a conference room on the second floor of a building on North 4th Street, 8 of us around a table that wasn't red oak, just laminate, cold under my palms. The attorney, a calm man named Desmond Achebe, No relation, a coincidence Otis would have found funny. Opened a folder and read numbers out loud the way you'd read a weather report, flat, precise, undeniable. Otis Kilbride, it turned out, had never actually signed away his ownership stake in Kilbride and Sons. 40%, purchased with his own labor and cash across the 1970s, documented in a stock certificate dated March 3, 1974. In 1986, under pressure from his brother, he'd signed what everyone believed was a full buyout agreement, except the buyout agreement, filed and notarized, required by its own explicit terms, unanimous written consent of all shareholders to be finalized, and one signature line, Otis's own, had been left blank for 38 years. He'd told the attorney, apparently on a visit made alone, on a day none of us knew about, for months before Thanksgiving, that he'd never signed it because nobody ever really asked me, they just told me it was decided. And he'd been waiting, he said, to see if anyone in that family would ever ask him a real question again before he gave away what was still legally his. Nobody ever asked him. Except me on 2 buckets over a flathead 6-9 years running. The numbers came next. 40% of 38 years of retained and distributed profits from Kilbride and Sons, calculated by a forensic accountant the estate had hired, came to $341,000, owed in back distributions Genevieve and Marcus had drawn as if Otis's share didn't exist. Marcus put both hands flat on the table like he was trying to hold it still. Genevieve made a sound I'd never heard a grown woman make before, somewhere between a laugh and a cough, and said, "That can't be right, he would have told us," and her voice cracked exactly once untold, and I watched 38 years of certainty go out of her face like a pilot light. Then the attorney set the toolbox on the conference table. Otis had left instructions that it be brought, unopened, to this exact meeting, and he handed me the key because Otis had left the box and everything in it, and his full remaining ownership stake in Kilbride and Sons Salvage Incorporated, to me, Odalise Ferreira, the only member of this family who ever asked me a question she wanted the answer to. Inside, under a layer of spark plugs and cotter pins he'd clearly used as camouflage for anyone careless enough to jimmy the lock, was the original 1974 stock certificate, the unsigned 1986 buyout agreement, and $412 in cash rolled in a rubber band, his whole liquid savings, which told you everything about a man who'd had every reason to be bitter and had chosen, instead, to be exact. I read the room the numbers, and I read them the sentence he'd said to me the night of the pork chops, the one about being thanked and being right being 2 different things, and I said it wasn't mine to be proud of, it was his, and that the only thing I'd ever done for him was ask him things and listen to the answers, which apparently in that family had made me rich. Priscilla started crying, not for Otis I don't think, but for the truck, for the whole shape of what she'd wanted and hadn't gotten and now definitely wasn't getting. Genevieve didn't cry again. She just sat very still, the way Otis used to sit still on that folding chair, and I understood, for one uncomfortable second, that the fear I'd seen flicker across her face at Thanksgiving hadn't been about the truck at all. It had been about exactly this, about a ledger somewhere, kept by somebody, finally getting read out loud. I didn't sue anyone, though the attorney told me I had every legal ground to. I offered Genevieve and Marcus 18 months to arrange repayment on generous terms, no interest, no lawsuit, on one condition, that they sign in front of the same attorney, a written acknowledgement of exactly what had happened, for the family record, so no future Thanksgiving would ever again get to pretend a vote had occurred that hadn't. Genevieve refused to sign anything. She said she'd rather go to court than admit to something written down like that. Marcus signed. Genevieve did not. So it went to court, cleanly on paper with numbers, exactly the way Otis would have wanted, not out of anger but because a debt with no signature is just a story, and Otis had spent his whole last year making sure the story finally had one. Marcus's daughter, the 13-year-old who'd started to ask, "Wait, is Uncle Otis?" and never got to finish, wrote me a letter that fall. She said she remembered the unfinished sentence too, and she was sorry nobody had let her ask it, and could she come by the shop sometime and learn what a torque wrench was for. I said yes. I didn't need to be cruel to her mother in front of her to make the point land. Some corrections make themselves quietly, one visit at a time. The Ranger still sits in my driveway. Nobody's asked for it since. I used part of the settlement to buy out Marcus's remaining shares in Kilbride and Sons, folded the salvage yard's engine rebuild business into my own shop, and put Otis's original red oak workbench, the same one, moved out of that garage the week after the funeral, against the back wall of my second bay, where I keep my good tools and nobody else's. Every morning I open the shop, and every morning before anything else, I run my thumb along the edge of that bench the way he used to run his thumb along a padlock, checking that the important thing is still exactly where it should be. Here's what I want you to take from this, and it's not about trucks or money or family dinners. Overlooked people are not unimportant people. They're just unasked people. Somebody in your life right now is sitting in the folding chair at the far end of the table, and they are keeping something, a story, a truth, a locked box, that they are only waiting for someone to ask about honestly. Today, not next week, call that person. Not to check on them the way you check a box. Ask them one real question you actually want the answer to, and then sit still long enough to hear it. If this story moved you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments who your Otis is, and subscribe for the next one, because there's always a next one, and somebody somewhere is still sorting bolts by thread pitch waiting to be asked. I'll see you in the next one.